Well, welcome tonight. We are going to spend 2 weeks talking about Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 to 10. And this is the text that is about the millennium, the 1,000-year reign. The only place in the Bible where the 1,000-year reign is specifically mentioned as a 1,000-year reign. You won't find that anywhere else in the Bible. Only here is it identified as 1,000 years, which has created a lot of controversy over the history of the church. And the church has variously interpreted this text from almost the beginning. We can find people thinking about the millennium in a premillennial way, even in the 2nd century. By premillennial, we understand Christ's return is before the millennium. When Christ returns, then the millennium is established. And Christ then is on earth for 1,000 years, reigning for 1,000 years. And then when the 1,000 years are up, then we have the new heaven and new earth, right? People go into their eternal destinies. So that's premillennial. Christ comes before the millennium. Then there's a postmillennial understanding that says the millennium is a kind of golden age era of the church. We may not be in it right now. We may be on the verge of it. We may be headed toward it. But there's going to be a 1,000-year period, which may be symbolic or it may be literal. There's going to be a 1,000-year period before Christ comes that the church will have a golden age and fill the earth. Right? And then Christ will return after the millennium. So that's post-millennial. Then there's another view that's called amillennial, which is an unfortunate name because it's not that somebody believes there's no millennium. That's what would typically mean. Amillennial, like no millennium. It's rather that they believe the millennium is contemporary with the present age, that we're already experiencing the millennium, whatever that is, that we're already experiencing it. And so from the time that Jesus ascended and was enthroned at the right hand of God until Jesus comes again, that's the millennium, because Christ is reigning in heaven and the kingdom is already here. So those are the 3 major views in reading this text. And we can find all of those views scattered throughout the history of the church. It has created a lot of controversy in the last 200 years, less than 200, no, more about 200, because of the rise of what is called dispensational premillennialism. And dispensational premillennialism understands the time before the second coming of Christ and before the millennium as a period of great tribulation. There's going to be a rapture. The saints are going to be raptured up either before the tribulation or in the middle of the tribulation. The tribulation is going to last 7 years. And then at the end of the tribulation, Christ will return and defeat evil and establish the 1,000-year reign. Right? So you have not just premillennial, but you have additional ideas associated with the kingdom, a rapture, 7-year tribulation upon the earth, and then Christ comes. And then you have the millennial reign. All right. So those, that you can see it gets confusing pretty quickly here. And people argue very passionately about this, and they feel passionate about it. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the Tim LaHaye Left Behind kind of books or movies. That's a dispensational premillennial picture of the end of the world. Yeah, we're not going to be able to get involved in all of that. But this text is kind of it's a pressure point. This is the text that people argue about. I mean, there are other texts too, but this is the one that actually mentions 1,000-year reign. Right? Now, what I'm interested in talking about this text is I'm not interested so much in the controversies, though we'll have to talk about that a little bit to get to where I want us to go. I'm more interested in the pastoral meaning, the pastoral comfort that this text brings when it's understood, at least in the way that I want to understand, or I think it should be understood. Yeah, Pete. It's one of the best books on hope. Yeah, because exactly, because it says we're going to win, right? I mean, that's clear. The clear message of Revelation is there's going to be a new heaven and new earth, and God is going to defeat evil. That's a clear message in Revelation. Yeah, whatever we might say about whatever the millennium is, everyone will agree. At least Christians who are reading this will agree. Yeah, God's going to win, and that's the hopeful message, right? So yeah, definitely. Now, to get at this, we need to think about what Revelation is and how it tells its story. And the handout that you have, which will be on the blog, I'm not going to go over every detail of that. What I'm going to do is put on the board a kind of a visual representation of this and give us a way of talking about it, so that we can watch the story unfold a little bit in Revelation. Because you have to read it. Revelation is like it's an apocalyptic book. That's what word Revelation means, apocalypse. So apocalyptic is a way of visualizing it. Over and over again, John says, and I saw, and I saw, and I saw. There's Tom. He's already here. Look about that. Hey, Tom, glad you made it, brother. Yeah, good to have you. It's all right. So, and I saw, and I saw. So it's a visionary book. It's what he sees. So it's not like he's writing a letter like Paul writing to Corinth or something and being discursive and saying, this proposition and because of this and then because of that. No, this is just a series of visions. I saw and I saw and I saw. And I think the way I read Revelation is that there's a phrase called in the Spirit. You can see it on the first chart on the first page there. In the Spirit is used 4 times in Revelation. In Revelation 1, verse 10, in Revelation 4, verse 2, and then 17:3, is that right? And then 21, 8, 9, no, 10, right? 21, 8 or 10? 10, yeah. And I think, in my opinion, and not everybody agrees with this, okay? I mean, I probably can say that about everything I say. Not everybody's going to agree with this. Yeah. But I think this represents 4 different visions. And in the middle of these visions, he sees different things. He'll see this, and then I saw that, and then I saw that, and then I saw that. But when you look at the phrase in the Spirit, it's 4 visions. 4 times he's in the Spirit, which I think is kind of prophetic vision. He's having a vision. He's in the Spirit. One of them is on the Lord's Day, and basically it's a vision that's chapter 1 to 3, just to be general. Chapters 1 to 3. And this is where he addresses the churches of Asia Minor. Right? He's on the Isle of Patmos, and the kingdom is here. And these churches are experiencing the kingdom, but they're also experiencing trial and they're being tempted to accommodate. They're being tempted to assimilate. They're being tempted to give in to the culture, to give in to the worship of the emperor and other factors. So it calls them to resist, calls them to overcome, which becomes the key word, right? Those who overcome will receive a crown of life. Those who overcome will sit with Jesus on the throne. Those who overcome will have access to the tree of life. And so that's kind of the first vision. The second vision is John is taken up into heaven. He's taken up into heaven. And so now what he sees it from the throne room of God. Right? And as he sees what's going, he's going to watch what happens in the throne room of God and what comes out of the throne room of God, what comes from the throne room of God. And the first part of that is chapters 4 and 5, which is the throne room scene. But then we see, there's this book that needs to be opened. And when we're about to open it, we have 7 seals, and then 7 trumpets, and then 7 bowls, which are all judgment. The prayers of the saints have been saying, how long before you avenge us? How long before you bring justice to the earth? How long before you deal with this evil? That's the souls under the altar in chapter 6. And God says, okay, we're going to do that. And so these 7 seals are opening the book one at a time. And then 7 trumpets announcing the content of the book. And then the bowls are the plagues that God pours out upon evil to destroy evil. Right? And when we come to the third vision, here he's on the earth. He's in the wilderness, and he sees, let me put a line here. He sees the harlot riding a beast. And he says this beast has control over the whole earth and is doing evil, doing evil against the earth, and is using the wealth of the earth for its own sake. And then we have a judgment. So in chapter 19, we have a judgment. Chapter 16, we have a judgment. At the end of chapter 11, we have a judgment. In chapter 8, 1 to 5, we have a judgment. Right? As well as the other seals, because the seals are kind of 6 to 8, trumpets are 8 to 11, the bowls are 15 and 16. But it's all about judgment. These 7s are God's judgment, which is also what's happening here in 19. So the judgment of 19 is just a different perspective on the judgment of 16, 11, and 8. In fact, chapter 16 uses the language of Armageddon. You've heard that language probably before, the battle of Armageddon. That's chapter 16. But chapter 19 is also a battle. I think they're the same battle. They're just looking at it from different perspectives. One perspective is looking at it coming out of heaven. The other perspective is looking at it, watching the one come to earth, watching the rider on the white horse coming to judge evil in chapter 19. All this, I can know it can be complicated and problematic, right? But I'm trying to get to a point here. And let me raise that point right now before we get to chapter 20. Well, the last vision He's on a mountain, and he sees the new heaven and new earth. Right? Sees the new Jerusalem laid out before him, which is the final destiny of the righteous. Right? Now, in these judgment scenes, here's the really important point, I think, as we're going to try to get to what chapter 20 is about. Particularly, when is the millennium? That's kind of the controversial question. When is the millennium? Next week, we'll talk more about what is the millennium, right? But more focused on the when here. But before we get to the when, I want us to see how in each of these sevens, there is what we can call an interlude. An interlude. Or, if we don't call it an interlude, at least a space that says, well, if God's judging the earth, what's happening to the saints? Right? If God is judging the earth and the seven seals, and he's judging the earth and the seven trumpets, and he's judging the earth and the seven bowls, what's going on with the people of God? The followers of the Lamb. What's happening to them? Some of them are dying. They're being martyred. Right? It's a trial upon the earth. It's a struggle. The Christians are not escaping harm in the sense of, they're all living in a safe place on the earth. Right? That's not what's happening. Some of them are being martyred. Some of them have already been martyred. So the question then, if you're watching this movie and you're watching all this judgment stuff happening, how God is defeating the evil and judging the evil, the question that comes to our mind is, well, where are the saints? Where are the people of God? Where are the followers of the Lamb? And we get an answer. Chapter 7 answers that question. Chapter 11, particularly 14 and following, answer that question. Chapter 15 answers that question, 1 to 11 or so. And I think chapter 20 also answers that question. Now, let's just take a look at a couple of those texts, because I think this is the great comfort of the book of Revelation. As Pete said, yeah, the big story is we win. But the other part of the story is that God's going to judge evil. Evil is not going to win. And a part of that is how God receives his people in the midst of that judgment. So when we go to chapter 7 of Revelation, let's just take a quick look at these texts for a moment. We go to chapter 7. You notice it begins with the 144,000 in verse 1 and following. And God says, hey, if you look at chapter 7, it says, like in verse 4, all right, don't harm, don't do anything yet. But we've had 6 bowls poured out, all right? But chapter 7 says, whoa, don't do anything yet. In other words, what's happening in chapter 7 is simultaneous or prior to the 6 bowls. God says, I'm going to protect these people. Seal my 144,000. We don't have time to talk what all that might mean, but protect them. And then in verses 9 and following, we get this picture that you've heard of many times, I'm sure, that after this I saw, after he sealed them on the earth, then I saw a great multitude that no one could count from every nation and all the tribes and peoples and languages standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white with palm branches in their hand. Now, where are the 144,000 are where? They're on the earth, right? Because don't let the wind, don't let the earth, don't let, put the wind back, keep it down. And they were sealed, protected, owned. These are people who belong to God. To seal something is a sign of ownership. All right. So they belong to God. We're going to protect them. All right?
They're on the land.
And I think they're on the land. They're on the earth. Right? But this other group, this multitude, where are they? Yeah, they're before the throne. Right? In fact, we get a question. John says, who are these people? Well, actually, one of the elders asked John in verse 13, who are these people? And John says, I don't know. I'm just here watching. These are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. In other words, they're before the throne, protected by God, received by God. They came out of the tribulation. They came from the earth, you might say, and now have gone into heaven. They've moved from earth to heaven. On the earth, they're in danger. They need protection from the winds and the evil. But now they're in the throne room of God, and God is their shepherd. And God is their shield, and the sun will no longer scorch them, and God will wipe away all their tears. They're present before God. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think they had any problem at all. This is common language. This is common literature. We got all kinds of examples of apocalyptic literature from the Second Temple Judaism, from the time 1st century, 2nd century, 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, 1st century AD. So when we read it, we think, wow, that's really weird, but it wouldn't be weird to them. What would be think about a movie that might have seemed really weird to somebody else, but we really understand what's going on in the movie, but other people might not. Just different cultures happen that way. Yeah, I think this was not written to hide anything. It's a revelation. It's an unveiling of Jesus. It's an unveiling of what God is doing in the world. So it's not designed to hide anything. But that's kind of what's happening here, right? So then we have the 7th seal. But what happens in this interlude here in chapter 7 is simultaneous with that, right? With the unsealing of the book. It's called, in literature, it's called recapitulation. It's to look at something, it's to tell this story, and then say, well, now let me back up and tell you what else was going on. Right? Yeah, there was this judgment being poured out, but in chapter 7, he backs up and says, but let me tell you what else. Let me tell you what's happening to the saints during this judgment. And we get that again in the 7 trumpets, because when you come to chapter 11, let's go over there for just a minute. After you've had the 6 trumpets, in chapter 11, you have the resurrection in chapter 11, verse 11. It says these 2 witnesses who were killed, the church, the martyrs of the church are being killed, right? The church is suffering persecution. And so these 2 martyrs die. And in verse 11 it says, but after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet. And those who saw them were terrified. They were resurrected, right? And then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched. And at that moment, there was this great earthquake. In other words, what's happening to these martyrs who are dying? What's happening to them? Yeah, they're coming to life. They're coming to life. They're being taken up into heaven. You know? They're not just being, their bodies are not just decomposing, but they, as persons, are being taken up into heaven, right? Or in chapter 15, another indication of what's happening to the saints. Like in verse 15, chapter 15, verse 1, then I saw another portent in heaven. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mixed with fire. And then in verse 3, and notice who he saw. Those who had conquered the beast, this is verse 2, chapter 15, verse 2. Those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Great and amazing are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. In other words, where are the saints? When God is pouring all this judgment upon the earth, where are the saints? Well, they're up there by the sea. And the sea is what you saw in chapter 5, or chapter 4. There was a sea before the throne. They're up there by the throne. So that's kind of the point of these judgment scenes where we are being told God's pouring out his wrath, but not upon the saints. The saints are being protected and loved and accepted and welcomed into the throne room of God. Now, what we have missing here is 12 to 14, right? Well, 12 to 14 is itself kind of a backstory section where we get the people who are involved in this story identified. The dragon is identified, the woman is identified, the beast that comes out of the sea is identified, the beast that comes out of the earth. But what I'm interested in here is, okay, well, what about the saints? What's happening to the saints? With all this stuff going on, what's happening to the saints? Well, chapter 14, verses 1 and following. Chapter 14, 1 and following. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were the 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the sound of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they sing a new song before the throne, and before the four living creatures, and before the elders. And these were the ones who were redeemed from the earth. The saints who died and now are before the throne. Or, you know this verse in chapter 14, verse 13. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. So what happens when you die? You're blessed. You're blessed when you die. You rest. And you have a harp and are before the throne of God. And you sing a new song, a song of redemption. It's a picture of what happens to the saints in the midst of all this judgment. So you have that same picture in chapter 14 that you had in 7, 11, 15. And what I want to suggest is 20 is also that kind of picture. It's just another picture of this reality here in 7 and 11, 14 and 15 that is intending to answer the question, what about the saints? And each of these, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, a recapitulation. Right? They're telling the same story, the same judgment, but they're just recapitulating. They're telling it over and over again, but maybe with some intensification, maybe with some different angles, but you're telling the same story. We went through Daniel. We had recapitulation in Daniel, didn't we? Chapter 2, you had the statue, the 4 parts of the statue, and you had the 4 beasts in chapter 7. And then you talked about the 2 of the beasts in chapter 8. So recapitulation is part of it's a literary device that helps us see things from different angles. Directors in movies use that kind of thing a lot, right? Or you back up in the story and you see something. The Chosen does that, right? They back up into the story. And so you see something that happened previously. In the midst of the story, you're going backwards. Or you're telling something simultaneous. That's just a literary device. And so when we come to chapter 19, and this is where it gets sticky. Right? Revelation chapter 19. And we're going to start at verse 11. We have a judgment scene, the rider on the white horse. Faithful and true. In righteousness, he judges and makes war. Right? So he's going to make war. He's going to make war against the nations, against the beast and the false prophet and Satan, the dragon. And he's going to defeat them. And he comes with the armies of heaven in verse 14. And they're wearing fine linen. He's coming with the saints and the angels. He's coming with everybody to defeat the enemy. And what happens is, you look in verse 17, it's a supper. They're going to eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of captains. And in verse 18 is actually a quotation from Ezekiel 39 about Gog and Magog, the defeat of the armies of, you could call them the enemies of God. Right? And then I saw in verse 19, the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against the rider on the horse. But you notice there's not a battle. They gather to make war, but it's over. It's not like there was just 3-year conflict or something. It's done. There's no battle, really. They gathered to battle, but there's no battle. God just destroys them. All right, so here's the tricky point. Let's read Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. And we'll think about the when. When is the millennium? Then I saw, by the way, I don't know if your translation says then I saw. There's no then in the Greek text. It just says and I saw. The same thing he's used like 35 times. And I saw, and I saw, and I saw. Even in these, and I saw, right? Talking about something that happened before the bowls. And I saw. Right? So it doesn't mean then like chronologically next. It's more like, and I saw, like I saw something else. I saw this, and I saw something else. Doesn't tell you anything about which comes first. It's just 2 different visions, 2 different sights. Now, if it said after this, yeah, okay, that would make a difference. But it doesn't say that. It says, and I saw. And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and locked and sealed it over, so that he would deceive the nations no more, until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be let out for a little while. Let's go down to verse 7. Excuse me. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. They are as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were already. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. All right, now this is a lot of controversy about this. So if we have in chapter 19 the defeat, and we have the battle, sometimes your translation will translate it war instead of battle. If you look at the, where's the handout I have about that? Yeah, at the bottom of page 2, where I have the sixth bowl, and I have chapter 19, the Word of God, and I have after the millennium. It's at the bottom of page 2 there. This is chapter 16, verse 14, chapter 19, verse 19, and chapter 20, verse 8. And each of these texts talk about gathering for the battle. So chapter 16, they're gathering for the battle. In chapter 19, they're gathering for the battle. The nations are gathering for the battle, led by Satan, led by the dragon. And then in chapter 20, verse 8, they're gathering for the battle. What I want to suggest to you is that the battle here in 16 and the battle here in 19 and the battle in 20, verse 8, they're all the same battle. It's not three different battles. It's the same battle. It's the battle. It's the final conflict between good and evil. It's the final conflict between the people, between the followers of the Lamb, between God and Satan. Right? Now, if that's true, then when we get to chapter 20 and verse 1, it's not that well, let me put it this way. What is described in chapter 19 is what is described in chapter 20, verse 8. So that what is described in 20 verses 1 to 3, the millennium, is something that comes before the battle. It comes before the battle. In other words, what is being described in chapter 20 is recapitulating, again, the question of what happened to the saints. Where are the saints? What's going to be true of the saints in this time when evil and good are in conflict, and Satan is deceiving, and Satan is gathering, is intending to gather, and the church is being persecuted because Satan is in the wilderness pursuing the saints. What's happening to the saints? And in chapter 20, verses 4 to 6, we get the answer. They're reigning with Christ. They're reigning. We're going to talk more about the what next week. But the critical question here is, when is the millennium? Is the millennium after chapter 19 chronologically, so that it is after the second coming of Christ, which is what I think chapter 19 describes, because it is the battle. Right? But if chapter 20 is after the battle, why do we have another battle? And if it's after the battle, why do we have nations who are still around that can be deceived? God has destroyed all the the evil kings of the earth, all the nations of the earth. Those were destroyed in chapter 19, but in chapter 20, they're still around. How can they still be around if they were destroyed? Right? And so what I would suggest is chapter 20 is recapitulating, just like 7 is recapitulating, right? 11 is recapitulating, that 20, 1 to 3, and is recapitulating as well. What that basically means is this. Chapter 19 describes the second coming of Christ. But chapter 20, verses 1 to 6, describe the time before Christ comes. That the millennium is before the second coming of Christ. And just as chapter 7 describes the saints in heaven who are moving from earth to heaven by death, and just as 14 talks about blessed are those who are dead who die in the Lord, and chapter 15 has the picture of the saints at the sea by the throne of God, so chapter 20 is that same, it's a different angle, but it's the same picture. The saints who are before the throne in chapter 7, the saints who are by the sea before the throne in chapter 14 and chapter 15, the ones who are caught up into heaven in chapter 11, that's the same people we're talking about in chapter 20. Chapter 20, verses 4 to 6. So we'll get to the what next week. Now, not everybody agrees with that. Not everybody, some people think, no, this is chronological. We have the second coming and then we have the millennium. It's a chronological sequence. And you can see how people might read it that way. I can understand why they would do that. Right? Especially the translation that says, and then. But then's not there, okay? There's no then. Right? But I think it's also, it's easier to read it that way, but it's not understanding what the book is doing as a whole or how it works. How does this story work? Judgment and then an insight into the status and the joy of the saints of God. These are they who have come out of the great tribulation, and they are before the throne, and the Lord is their shepherd, and the sun will scorch them no more, and they will no longer be thirsty, and they'll have no more pain or sorrow, and God will wipe away their tears, and God will be their shelter, and they reign with Christ. Right? That's part of the message of Revelation. It's not just that we're going to win in the end, although that is the message. That is the most important message. We're going to win in the end. God is going to defeat evil, and there will be a new heaven and new earth. That is the win. But before we get to the win, before we get to that full new heaven and new earth, there's another win. And that is death does not win by destroying the people of God. That's not a win for death. Because when the saints die, they become a part of that gathering around the throne. That's a win. That's a win. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the what of the millennium next week. Yeah, Pete. Yeah. Well, yeah, there's you have at the beginning of the book and the end of the book things that will happen soon. And he's talking to the 7 churches of Asia. Yeah, y'all are going to experience this real soon, right? But the story is more than just soon, right? It's about that the whole time of the time between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. And what happens to good and evil in that? What happens to evil? Well, God doesn't love evil. God is judging evil. God is always for his people. And the saints who die, those who die in the Lord, blessed are those who die in the Lord, right? Because God welcomes them into the throne room. And they no longer have sorrow, and they no longer have pain and suffering. They're no longer scorched by the sun. That God is their shepherd, and he has put his canopy over them. Right? Just put yourself back in that moment. Just as we put ourselves in this moment. Your brothers and sisters are being martyred because they won't worship the emperor. And so you go to church next Sunday, and you say, well, where are they? What happened to them? We lost. The emperor killed them. The emperor's winning. Right? I mean, that's kind of how you might think about that. Why doesn't God protect them? Why doesn't God help us? Right? The souls under the altar. How long, O Lord? How long? The souls under the altar in chapter 6. And the message to the churches is, yes, the empire is killing our people. But they're waking up alive. Right? The empire is killing our people, but they're not winning. Because those who die in the Lord are resting from their labors. That's the pastoral point of these texts. And that's the point I want us to get to next week when we look at Revelation 20. I hope I didn't confuse you too much here. We didn't talk about everything in the handout. But the basic point is Revelation recapitulates itself. It tells the same story over and over. Right? The same battle is told in different versions, but it's the same battle. And that the defeat of evil and the welcoming of the saints into the presence of God, I think, are the two major concerns in Revelation, and ultimately what God will do. Yeah, I know that's a lot to take in because there's so much here that I'm not able to unfold everything here as well as I would like. But hopefully we'll clarify some things next week if you're too confused. But we'll get to the meat of it next week when we talk about the what of the millennium. What is it? Right? Tonight, when is it? In my opinion, the when is now. The millennium is now. And the saints are reigning in heaven. Those who have died in the Lord, they're reigning in heaven. It's now. Right? And again, not everybody's going to agree with that. So, and we don't have to. We don't have to agree on it. It's okay. Because we can all still talk about blessed are those who die in the Lord, right? And we can talk about the defeat of evil, ultimately. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
Y'all think about if you want to meet someone for dinner in 2 weeks.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. God bless you.